That long approach under light airs before the battle, the sheer inspiring leadership, but the basic discipline of men waiting there by their guns, many of them veterans of battle who know what's going to come and who are going to have to rely on adrenaline, basically, I should say, to take them through that sort of carnage. We tend, I think, to have the picture of that inexorable advance on the combined fleet, those two lines coming down with every stitch of sail set because there are light winds. But there's another aspect of the weather which Nelson didn't ignore, and which I think all his captains would have noticed because they're veterans of blockade on the Atlantic coast, and many of them specifically of Cadiz. There's a heavy swell rolling in, almost certainly presaging a severe storm. If that storm arrives after the battle, the Spanish coast to the east of them, that coast with off-lying reefs all the way from Cadiz to Cape Trafalgar, will be a death trap. It'll be a lee shore. Ships which have been dismasted, ships with depleted, tired, and shocked crews will have no chance on that coast.
Hello. On this date, 219 years ago, on the 21st of October 1805, 27 ships of the line of the Royal Navy, under the command of Admiral Horatio Nelson, engaged the combined fleets of France and Spain. Nelson sent the signal, "England expects every man to do his duty," and over the next few hours, under terrible fighting conditions, the British fleet overcame their enemy and won a famous victory, but at a cost. Joining to discuss the Battle of Trafalgar is naval historian and hydrographer Michael Barritt, author of Nelson's Pathfinders, as we discuss the conditions, the seamanship, and the hydrography, which is the discipline of naval intelligence, the method to chart seabeds. It's worth remembering the Royal Navy lost twice as many ships to shipwreck as to battle. Plenty more great history is on the way, so please do follow or subscribe, and if you can give a gentle review, that would be very kind. But until then, it's me talking with Michael Barritt on the Battle of Trafalgar. Michael, welcome to the pod. A great pleasure to have you on.
Likewise, a great honor to join you, Oliver.
Great stuff. Well, listeners, it really is a pleasure to have Michael on, author of a new book that's getting very positive reviews, Nelson's Pathfinders, a forgotten story in the triumph of British sea power. Now, Michael, we're really talking today, it is the anniversary of the Battle of Trafalgar, the 219th, 219th.
Yes.
Right. My maths is so bad. So yes, battle 21st of October 1805, and this is the battle that, as listeners may have heard with my conversation with Dominic Sambrook, we briefly discussed the sort of result of Trafalgar, and this means that Britain is basically unmolested on the seas for another 100-odd years, give or take the odd skirmish here and there. But Trafalgar, I mean, as a naval historian and as a veteran of the Royal Navy, I wondered how much is Trafalgar, has it sort of echoed down the ages for naval historians and indeed in the Royal Navy itself?
Yeah, I think it had a mixed impact. I'm glad you've asked that question because it's been one that's been going through my mind, particularly with the what if question. What if the battle had not taken place? What if the Villeneuve had managed to slip back and into the Mediterranean? What would the difference have been? If one thinks about it, the Navy would have carried on much that the British Navy would have carried on much that it had done and would do for the rest of the war, blockading the French. The French would have been a continuing fleet in being. A blooming nuisance. So when it got to 1812 and the Americans revealed their hostility to us, the necessity to keep the French fleets pinned down in their bases was a colossal ball and chain round our ankles. I always remember when I was doing my finals, I regurgitated one paper that I'd read. I'm not sure it exactly fitted the question, but it was a bit of research which has shown that at the end of the Napoleonic Wars, Napoleon actually had a bigger naval force than before Trafalgar, which is quite a striking statistic. And much of it was based in Antwerp, the pistol pointed at the heart of England. Um, so what if? And I think also there's an element of mythology around Trafalgar, which sometimes has not been very helpful with the Royal Navy. Nicholas Rodger has brought this out very interestingly in his new volume, how the Royal Navy in much of the 19th century neglected other aspects of naval strategy and tactics with a fixation on tactics, the big battle that had to be fought and won in an annihilating fashion, just as Nelson had done. And I think one sees that working out in the First World War with Jutland. Um, who won Jutland? Or was it just an indecisive action? And if it was an indecisive action, the balance of advantage was with Britain. The northern blockade was maintained. Germany was crippled by that economically, as worked out in 1918. So you see these threads running through the history. How important is the crushing battle? I think at the end of the day, people feel that it certainly was a victory of morale,
Yes,
which did put the
yes.
seal on British sea control.
Yes, I mean, I was talking to Nicholas Rodger recently, and the impression like it is very interesting. The thesis in his book about how the Royal Navy responded over the next 100 years, and it almost feels unfair on Nelson in that his legacy. I guess it's a nice problem to have in that the Royal Navy, lacking a major rival on the seas, then did sort of decline somewhat. But and it feels unfair to put that at the door of Nelson, who of course couldn't help but win and then die. I wondered then similarly, what about, okay, we've talked about Trafalgar and its legacy. What about Nelson and his legacy, and in the Royal Navy today, and not and as a naval historian? I mean, your book writes about his pathfinders.
Hmm. Hmm.
What about his legacy?
Yes, I think just stepping back to the battle, that he was out for an annihilating victory, and he claimed that that's what he'd been sent out to do. Now, I've not checked back through through the sources, but certainly it's what the British populace expected. And if we remember poor old Calder, whose action earlier on, if anything, put the final kibosh on any French attempted invasion, he was castigated and very unfairly because it was an indecisive battle, but it was actually a strategically a decisive one in that Villeneuve turned away from the channel. But Nelson had that extraordinary mystique, and from the time of the Nile, people expected nothing less from him than the same sort of devastating victory. I think that must have weighed on him a bit heavily, but it was of his nature to produce that. I think there are other aspects of Nelson, though, that I personally value and which I think have been important in the Navy and should be in a very constructive way. He's an immensely attractive character, despite all his weaknesses. I would pick out particularly his enthusiasm and his generosity. I'll just use a little hydrographic example, if I may. There's a survey that was made by the master in Victory, Thomas Atkinson, and he was assisted by a young officer. And Nelson sent that into the Admiralty. And in his letter, he said, "Why, this is the finest open roadstead I've ever come across." Full of enthusiasm. I think he said that in the end about 6 different anchorages. And then the generosity, the young officer, he writes, has no interest. In other words, he's got no patrons, no one to help him get on. Nelson instantly promotes him. And we see it in the Trafalgar campaign. I think it's Roger Knight who writes of it, and John Sugden as well, both very compellingly, that in that fleet on the day of Trafalgar, it wasn't again like the Nile, the band of brothers who all knew him. very few of those officers had first-hand experience of Nelson, but somehow they just knew what he was about. He communicated to them just a spirit that carried them through, and he was quite an extraordinary man. When you consider he's a Norfolk man with a broad Norfolk accent, he's not one of your London knobs.
Oh, so he had a East Anglian accent, did he?
Yes, he did. That's commented on by a number of people. You can see it in particularly when he goes home. People recounted his conversations with them, and it's there. I remember Libby Purvis drawing that out once in a lovely talk she gave us after a dinner of naval commanding officers, and she was talking about an East Anglian man, and she spoke very eloquently about that background.
Fascinating, fascinating. Nelson, not only is the battle a triumph, but getting the French and Spanish fleets, we should remember it's a combined fleet up against him. Getting them to battle was also an extraordinary achievement as well. Is that right?
Yes. Um, I was just checking in my book before we met, Oliver, and if you enter Trafalgar into the find button on an electronic copy, I think you'll find one fairly broad reference to the battle. You'll find a lot to the campaign, and I'm personally, I think one of the most important books still about Trafalgar is the classic that Sir Julian Corbett produced way back at the beginning of the 20th century, The Campaign of Trafalgar. Um, and that certainly brings out the extraordinary strategic insight of Nelson himself, but also of those in government, Pitt himself, the Prime Minister, and the man who moved into the slot of first Lord of the Admiralty at the critical moment, Lord Barham, Charles Middleton. Their grasp of the threats and what Napoleon might do was so acute that we almost move inexorably to the encounter off Cape Trafalgar.
Yes, it's a real team effort. If we could just put the listeners into where we are in the autumn of 1805, Britain is still. I know that the risk to invasion was probably more acute a year or so before, but there's still very real concern that Napoleon still intends to invade. And so, what was the sort of state of play before in the lead up to the battle?
I think it's important, as Julian Corbett pointed out, to grasp that there are two centres of strategic interest, two areas where Napoleon can do immense damage. One was invasion. I'll come back to that in a moment. The other was the central Mediterranean. Um, there was a lot going on there, particularly following up the short peace after the war, the French Revolutionary War. Napoleon had his eye on the Levant. He was also determined to really grip Italy and establish himself there. And he would dearly have liked to have got hold of the strategic islands of Sardinia, Sicily, and Malta. Our refusal to give up Malta to the Knights Templar, was very deliberate because we knew Napoleon would be in there like a shot. So you've got those two centres of attention, and those are dominating the government's mind, if not the popular mind. I think the popular mind still is fixated on, oh, that rogue Napoleon. I'll give you my own view on invasion, which would be very similar to my view on 1940. I don't think Napoleon ever had a chance of invading. He had the troops there in the Low Countries. I'm not convinced from what I've read that he ever had enough craft to carry them across. And I'm certain sure they would have been decimated by the forces that Lord Keith had in the southern North Sea and Channel. I suspect that would have happened even if Napoleon's plan to combine the big fleets had happened. But if we actually look at the autumn of that year, Calder's action has taken place. Villeneuve has turned away from the Channel. Cornwallis has kept a real iron grip on Brest. The French just haven't been able to get their forces out of there. And in August of that year, Napoleon gives up the idea of invasion. He marches his army off to Austria. So already by the autumn, that threat's gone. And it's very significant that the government chooses to embark all its best troops ready to send them out to the Mediterranean. Now, it's just they would not have done that if they really were frightened of Napoleon making the invasion. And those troops are bound for the central Mediterranean. They're sent off with quite a slender escort. And the government, they must have had heart failure because just as they sent them off, Villeneuve reappeared from the West Indies. And that's an interesting little twist to the tale, but those were got through safely. So really, I think also one has to remember where Villeneuve was heading when he came out of Cadiz before the Battle of Trafalgar. He wasn't going north, south.
South.
Yeah, and he was going back to the Mediterranean. I suspect he'd have scuttled back into Toulon, but he could have caused chaos with that critical convoy taking those troops to the central Mediterranean.
I see. And so there is a little bit of cat and mouse, isn't there, with the respective fleets heading to the Caribbean and then back again.
The Caribbean feint. I think some debate over whether that was Napoleon's idea or not. I think it probably was. That the thought was to draw well, Nelson's Mediterranean fleet off there and as many of the others as possible, and that Beale never get back quicker than the people pursuing him and join up in the Channel. Also, Britain couldn't take the threat to the West Indies lightly. The threat to Jamaica. I think I haven't mentioned it yet, but I think it's such an important underlying factor. One brought out by Roger Knight in his most recent book, Convoys, really brilliant book. And that's at the end of the day, this is an economic war. Napoleon, shortly after Trafalgar, is going to smash the Allies on the continent. He's going to be master of the continent. He's going to try and close the continent, to British goods. But Trafalgar, certainly one thing it does is to confirm British sea power supremacy. The trade will flow. The bullion will continue to come from the Caribbean, which pays for Allied armies on the continent. And it's that underpinning strand that I think made it imperative for those ships, British ships, to be sent out just to check that all's well in the Caribbean.
So when we get to October and the combined fleets, actually, we should mention the size of the fleets, because I think that Nelson has sort of around about, I think I was doing a little bit of reading before this. He has about 27 ships of the line. And I think a ship of the line, we're talking a proper Napoleonic era battleship with what, around about 100 guns, roughly?
Yeah. The bulk of them would be 74 gun ships, handy ships. But one of the debates surrounding naval tactics and battle at this time is the respective importance of the three deckers, the big 100 gun or 90 plus or 100 gun ships disposed either side, plus some stern chasers and guns in the bows as well.
Right. And so these cannon are devastating at close quarters.
There are two types of cannon on board. There are the long guns, and then there are the carronades, named after the Carron factory in Scotland. Ships would have a mix of those. Some ships had all carronades, but generally you'd have a mix. And but the aim was to get to point blank range. It's reckoned that really the decisive factor in this battle was the drill of the British, the rate at which they could fire. And for that to have maximum effectiveness, every ship's captain was aiming to get it. They say that the ships were so close that sailors were reaching out and trying to grab the ramrods from the gunners in the enemy ship, that the muzzles of the cannon are almost touching the other ship. And so, particularly if you manage to rake a ship, if you manage to cross the stern, and the first broadsides in many of the British ships were double-shotted, i.e. two cannonballs in there, the effect was absolutely devastating. In one of the prolonged battles, there's a account of the side of the French ship just being blown away, and then they started to elevate the cannon and blew the deck away.
So it becomes a sort of husk.
Yes. I think it's the carronades rather than the long guns, which often would have been filled with a really nasty mix of chain shot and all sorts of other things to blast in and increase the devastation amongst personnel. I think the worst impact was splinter damage. People being mown down by splinters. Horrendous scenery, which puts into perspective, I think, that long approach under light airs before the battle, the sheer inspiring leadership, but the basic discipline of men waiting there by their guns, many of them veterans of battle who know what's going to come. And who are going to have to rely on adrenaline, basically, I should say, to take them through that sort of carnage.
Yes, it's extraordinary. And one thing that probably it's helpful for listeners to be aware of is that for the most part, and Trafalgar wasn't the first battle where Nelson broke the line, but is it true that for the most part, if you had a naval battle in this era, generally the fleets would sort of sail past each other, firing at each other, and that's why so many were inconclusive? And that the one of the unusual things about Trafalgar was Nelson's decision to split the line of ships. So I'm just trying to help. I'll put a link in the show notes so that the listeners can have a look at the layout of all the ships. But basically, it seems to have been in a kind of, I don't know, one large line going from north to south, and that's the Spanish and the French, and then the Royal Navy comes in at a right angle to split the two in two separate lines. I'm not explaining this very well, but could you just sort of explain? This is probably the extent of our tactical discussion, but this is the key to the devastating victory: is the decision that Nelson makes.
Um, just to pick up from the start, certainly further back in the 18th century, the naval battles have been, if you like, a little bit like a choreographed ballet. Yes, the aim was to get your two fleets in line and then batter away at each other. That began to be challenged in the Seven Years' War, where some British commanders essentially gave that famous cry of Nelson, just get alongside the enemy. If one thinks, for example, of the extraordinary battle in Quiberon Bay, where in a full gale, the British fleet pursued the French inshore, and then it was a case of a whole host of individual ship actions. The classic breaking the line battle was probably the Battle of the Saints by Rodney, 1782.
And Admiral Hood.
Yes.
There he is,
yes,
watching us.
yeah. And his flag captain was a man after my own heart, well, a man I'm very interested in, John Knight, and not one of the hydrographic practitioners. So that battle was remembered. It would be remembered by Nelson. Then, of course, some of the battles at the same time as Nelson's own first victory at the Nile were a sort of melee, Duncan at Camperdown. The Nile was the most devastating victory, and that was because, partly fortuitously, thanks to the courage and instinct of one of the leading captains who risked going inshore of the French because they knew nothing of the hydrography of this area. They were able to engage the enemy on both sides. Absolutely devastating. Now, some critics of Nelson have said, look, why didn't he try to achieve that at Trafalgar? Instead of which they came in these lines for ages. They were subject to the enemy broadsides themselves before they could break through. But it just seems to be that, and Nelson does seem to change his mind during the approach at Trafalgar. He's got the flexibility to do it. He broke the line in a different place to what he'd said he would.
Why did he do that?
Partly because he got word or a suggestion that the French admiral was not where he expected him to be. But Really, at the end of the day, what Nelson wanted to achieve was a situation where each British ship could get alongside an enemy one, um, and and do its worst, inflict the greatest damage. Now that the impact was going to be greatest where they broke through, the vessels on either side of them, by the time a whole line had gone through, were going to be blasted to pieces. But thereafter, the aim was that every one of the British ships would engage another one because he wanted complete victory, didn't want any ships escaping. He wanted to bring about a decisive action, and that seemed to him to be the way to do it.
Once they break the line, then they can then sort of split either side. And is that what happens after they do break through?
Yes, they alter course and run up, and hopefully the one that's got through first will move up the line. Sometimes they didn't; others had to go round them and go up to find an opponent. But that was the basic idea. And Collingwood's line was expected to deal with the rear and the after part of the centre. One aspect, and it was partly because of an initiative on the part of the Spanish admiral, the van of the combined fleet probably was not engaged as closely, certainly to begin with, as it might have been.
Oh, the Vanguard,
Foremost. That's
the
the
front.
foremost part of the line.
Hello, Ollie here. Please forgive my interruption, but I wanted to let you know that at Aspects of History, we produce a digital magazine featuring articles, interviews, short stories, and book reviews of the best historical writing available. Authors featured including Ben Macintyre, Lucy Worsley, Andrew Roberts, and plenty more. An annual subscription is available for only $9.99. That's pounds or dollars. Yep, you heard that right. That's 6 issues for under £10 or dollars. Head over to aspectsofhistory.com to subscribe, where you can also gift subscriptions since Christmas is coming. Now back to the show. Okay, I mean, how long did the battle go on for?
It was about 5 hours, and I just want to correct what I just said because, of course, the fleet reversed course. So, in fact, it was what had been the van and was then the rear, which got off rather more likely.
So for 5 hours, and really it sounds like when you look at the result of the battle with, I think you really wanted to capture a ship rather than sink it. Is that fair to say?
As long as it was forced to surrender, that was the objective. Very few ships from these battles were in a fit state to be subsequently taken into the Royal Navy, which had been done a lot previously. I don't think I can remember that any of the French or Spanish ships that survived, and that's a point we might come to in a minute, was taken into the Navy. They were just so badly smashed up.
I see, because they're worth a huge amount, these battleships, aren't they?
And some very fine examples. The Spanish, in particular, wonderful shipbuilders, and the Spanish flagship Santissima Trinidad, quite the most remarkable ship there on the scene. A vast vessel.
We haven't really mentioned a key moment in the battle, which is towards the end, which is when a cowardly French sharpshooter shoots Nelson. And this is a terrible event because the victory is right alongside the
Redoutable, I think, is the one. Mm.
Right. And this was a sort of a common threat that you might face incoming fire from opponents' Marines who would be up in the ropes and the sails.
They'd be up in the tops of the masts. Yes, I think it was actually comparatively early in the battle when it happened. By which stage, what Nelson or any other commander in chief could do was, in terms of direction, was pretty limited. He'd given all the ships their instructions, and they got on with it. And I think, to be fair to the French, and they knew they had skilled sharpshooters, and they used them very intelligently. And I've no doubt we had likewise had some in our topmast.
Yes, but ours were sort of brave chaps who at great personal risk.
All I would say in general terms is that I think that the combined fleet acquitted themselves extremely well in terms of raw courage and also in some instances initiative. And Captain Luca of the Redoutable was undoubtedly one of those. So was another man from my fraternity, Alcala Galliano, distinguished Spanish hydrographer, and they had some very distinguished chart makers. He'd been out on the northwest coast of America, knew Vancouver. Probably some of the British people at Trafalgar would have known him. He used his initiative. In fact, it was he who really revitalized the battle in that area we were talking about, where there hadn't been such hot action. But he was killed, and on Isla de Leon, south of Cadiz, they've got this wonderful. There's a mausoleum essentially of the Spanish heroes, and he's one of the ones in there. They fought well,
Well,
perhaps didn't have the skill in many respects, bearing in mind that if you're in a fleet that's blockaded, your chance to get out, to build up the skills of seamanship, the operation of guns in certain conditions, which it would be interesting to come to in a moment, actually. That was undoubtedly a drawback for them.
yes, let's talk about that. So, yes, it's ultimately victory is down to superior seamanship and
Gunnery.
rate of fire.
Yeah. Mm.
And why were the British seamen so effective at the rate of fire?
Just essentially practice. It's interesting whether this one could say is an is an after effect of Trafalgar, but by 1812 there are many who were saying that the Navy had neglected gunnery. They got complacent, and as they found out with some of the first encounters with the American frigates, which were very substantial vessels, they were almost mini ships of the line, we came off worst until someone who had paid attention, acute attention to gunnery, Brooke, the Shannon, won his famous victory. So it was something it had to be refined. And there were financial implications. How often could you exercise? How much shot could you expend? How much gunpowder could you expend? But gunnery practice, regular gunnery practice, would have been the key to it.
One person we should mention is, are you familiar with Miguel Ricardo de Alava?
Mm.
The only man, I think, to be present at Trafalgar and then also Waterloo 10 years later.
Oh my word, yes, I'd forgotten that. Yes,
Yes.
extraordinary.
Incredible fellow. There's a statue of him in Vitoria in the Basque Country I saw a
Mm.
few years ago.
Mm.
I might dig a photo of that somewhere and stick it on the old Instagram. So the battle is now won, but Nelson is dying. And as you say, he's shot once again, I should mention, in a most cowardly fashion. And his life is ebbing away
Mm.
through much of the battle. But so
Mm.
he's getting constant updates from his men, is he?
Indeed. He's curious throughout. And one thing he does do is that at one point when Hardy's with him, he reinforces or restates an order which he had issued amongst the stream of orders that had gone out really in the approach to the battle. He'd sent an order, anchor at nightfall after the battle. And he reinforces that to Hardy. This perhaps is the only way in which hydrography, in a sense, creeps into this story. Hydrography, which I've written about in my book, the title, I did worry about the title for a while. I thought people would say, Nelson's Pathfinders. Oh, here we go, rattling the Nelson drum again. And well, perhaps we'll let him off. Perhaps that's just John Masefield and Brian Lavery's shorthand, Nelson's Navy. But no, I really wanted to make the point that, like many other senior officers of the day, Nelson was acutely conscious of the importance of hydrography for operational and navigational intelligence. And his appreciation is there at Trafalgar. The influence of hydrography is not as immediately and dramatically evident as at the Nile or Copenhagen. In both those battles, the approach to the enemy was constrained by hydrography, and Nelson's forces on both occasions were reduced by vessels running aground. But there is an indication of his awareness with that order to anchor. We tend, I think, to have the picture of that inexorable advance on the combined fleet, those two lines coming down with every stitch of sail set because there are light winds. But there's another aspect of the weather which Nelson didn't ignore, and which I think all his captains would have noticed because they're veterans of blockade on the Atlantic coast, and many of them specifically of Cadiz. There's a heavy swell rolling in, almost certainly presaging a severe storm. If that storm arrives after the battle, the Spanish coast to the east of them, and I've got here an extract from a contemporary chart. It's by John Knight. Probably won't show desperately clearly. John Knight, the man I mentioned, that coast with off-lying reefs all the way from Cadiz to Cape Trafalgar will be a death trap. It'll be a lee shore. Ships which have been dismasted, ships with depleted, tired, and shocked crews will have no chance on that coast. And that's why he said anchor. In the event, probably most of them couldn't through battle damage, and so Collingwood never issued that order. But I just want to read you an extract. It was in the Naval Chronicle. It's from a British inhabitant of Cadiz, and he was there after the battle, and he was aghast at the horrors he'd seen on the quays as the wounded were landed. So,
Michael, how close would the battle have been to the coast? I guess people would have been able to hear it, but
oh yes, they wouldn't have seen anything, but they'd have heard the guns. Yeah. So he says, I passed through the town to the point. I beheld the terrible effects of the battle. As far as the eye could reach, the sandy side of the isthmus bordering on the Atlantic was covered with masts and yards, the wrecks of ships, and here and there bodies of the dead. Um, um, Staff appreciations, meteorology, hydrography, they're both in there. Had the battle been out in the Atlantic further out, meteorology would have been the critical factor, but the admirals would have known that after the battle they'd have sea room. If the storm came in, there'd be time for them to drift and recover. Not there off Trafalgar.
extraordinary.
And Nelson knew that.
Amazing. Yeah, I didn't know about that. That's incredible. And of course, the whole country's almost the knowledge of victory is almost overridden by the sort of shock and grief over the loss of Nelson. What was the effect of his death on the Royal Navy? Because he was loved by his men, wasn't he?
We know from the sheer numbers who contrived to be there for his funeral, the colossal emotional impact, not least on the lower deck, the sailors who were. I think it's great they were allowed to be there. They were a prominent part of it. But I think people picked themselves up, dusted themselves down, and got on with the job. And no one more so than Collingwood, whom we haven't mentioned and ought to mention, who steps up immediately to the burden of command, who thereafter, I can't remember if he got home at all after the battle, but he goes out to the Mediterranean. He never gets home again. And worn out, he finally is allowed by the government. Wouldn't let him come home. We can't let you come home. We need you there. He eventually gets permission to come home, dies on the voyage back. An extraordinary figure. But the just the example of Nelson, probably a prominent example is Captain Host in the Adriatic, who at one of his famous victories said, "Remember Nelson."
Remember Nelson. Well, I hope the cry is still given out in the Royal Navy today. That would be nice. In the aftermath, of course, the French fleet's destroyed. The Spanish fleet is barely exists now. So the Royal Navy reigns supreme. But you mentioned at the start that by sort of within a few years, they have problems with the Americans in the War of 1812. And is that really comes down to the fact that they had no competitor. And so they could just sort of, I guess, rest on the laurels of Trafalgar.
I think that there's an element there, although it ought to be said that one gets a rather a distorted picture of the War of 1812 with the emphasis on the single ship actions. We blockaded the United States with devastating impact, as Andrew Lambert has brought out in his account of the war. We got up the rivers. We famously burnt the White House. We deployed amphibious power rather disastrously down in the Gulf of Mexico, but nonetheless, by the end of that war, some people in the States were pulling their hair out, not least in the northeastern states who never wanted the war, who were busy supplying most of the corn we needed for our troops in Spain. That they didn't want it at all. But undoubtedly, it was a bit of a shock for us. Having said that, we were still keeping a remarkable number of campaigns going. One that has got more attention recently than it used to, and deservedly so, is our presence in the Baltic with Admiral Saumarez. It's important to recall that after Trafalgar, Napoleon, he doesn't relent in terms of trying to challenge Britain at sea. And whilst he's rebuilding his own fleets, what he tries to do is grab everyone else's. That's why we had the Second Battle of Copenhagen, rather notorious because of our bombardment of the city. But we couldn't allow the Danish fleet to fall into the French hands, hence that campaign. He was after the Portuguese fleet. We beat him to it. We sailed it off to Brazil, protection. So his tentacles are reaching out, and he was quite pleased to get what was left of the Spanish fleet, but that didn't last long because his disastrous invasion of Spain brought them over to our side. So there's another 10 years of war to go after Trafalgar, and jolly testing it was, and with plenty of fighting, strategic thought to be devoted to it.
It's interesting what you say about the Danish fleet. It's a little bit like the attack on the French fleet
Absolutely.
in 1940.
Yeah, entirely analogous, yes.
Right. Well, yeah, so interesting. We've the War of 1812 been mentioned a number of times when the Americans quite disgracefully decided to challenge us on the seas. One of the reasons that they tried to, and I'm just interested in this since you've mentioned the War of 1812, is that they felt that we had the British, I should say, be a little bit more impartial. The British had been taking American citizens and recruiting them into the Royal Navy, which who I presumably they were very keen to do so. Who wouldn't want to join the Royal Navy? But this is one of the reasons they gave for war. It strikes me many historians think this is rather an unfair accusation that the Americans made. Have I got that wrong?
It's a complex issue. Arguably the biggest challenge for naval administrators in that day was manning the fleet. It entailed being very good at persuading people to volunteer, but it did involve a lot of impressment. We had an impressment service around our coasts, incoming merchant ships, British and mainly British, could expect to lose most of their crew if there was a warship lurking. And because merchant ships in those days were multicultural communities, sometimes it was very difficult to discriminate, even if you tried to. I'm not saying they always tried to. An American seaman generally would have a set of papers to prove he was American, but those could be doubted. And it was those sort of instances where the antipathy amongst the Americans built up. More generally, there was a different attitude to the exercise of sea power in a way and to maritime rights. But there were other powerful factors in play. Canada. There was undoubtedly a party in America which was greedy to get Canada. Interestingly, again, I think this was in Nicholas Rogers' book. Apparently, this arose again during the American Civil War. They'd quite like Britain to come into the conflict to give them another chance to grab Canada. So you've got a whole lot of things in play here in that war.
It's a fascinating period of history. It really is.
Mm.
I mean, why did you pick Napoleonic Wars to sort of study and write about? Because, of course, Britain's got a long naval past. There are plenty of periods of history to look at. Why particularly this? Are you interested in it?
I shall head off it in other directions next, but I did this really because my own part of the Navy, the hydrographic specialization, came into being. That's what I describe in the book, really, that the Napoleonic Wars underlined the need to have a specialist cadre of pathfinders, properly equipped with their own ships, which we didn't have. Much of the work I described was given by people, by the navigational specialists, the masters on board, and by captains who like Nelson grasped the importance of it. So that was the story I wanted to tell, and that's the forgotten story aspect. Sometimes you pick up a history book, and if you read of hydrography at all in that period in the context of the Royal Navy, it'll be a comment along the lines of, oh, the Royal Navy of that day showed neither an interest in nor an aptitude for hydrography. And I wanted to show that was wrong, which I've done. I prepared a more specialist book, which I'll try and get published, and that has a list of 350 plus Royal Naval personnel who made surveys. And those surveys were vitally important. If one looks at the campaign of Trafalgar as a whole, at the beginning of the campaign, for example, or indeed before the campaign, during the Peace of Amiens, the admiral who'd been left in the Mediterranean, a man called Richard Bickerton, put in hand an extraordinary series of surveys around one of those three strategic islands I mentioned, Sardinia. That would have been important to Nelson because if one goes back to the beginning of the Nile campaign, when he was sent into the Mediterranean to find the French, his ship got dismasted off Sardinia. And he didn't have a chart on board, nor was there one anywhere in the other ships in company of that coast. So he would be really aware of the need for it. And this was done during the peace. Copies were made quickly in London, sent back out. And at the start of the excuse me, the campaign of Trafalgar, Nelson is occupying arguably the most famous of those anchorages, which is up at the top end of Sardinia, in the Maddalena Islands on the flank of the Strait of Bonifacio. It was called Agincourt Sound because the most recent data collection there had been by HMS Agincourt. And it was particularly useful because it was open at both ends. So regardless of where the wind was, Nelson would be able to get out quickly. And that's where he was when the word came that Villeneuve was out. And the frigate came rushing into the anchorage. And so they were able to get out quickly and in pursuit. So it's an early example in that campaign of the importance of hydrography and of the pathfinders.
Fascinating. Will you come back to talk more about the hydrography then in a future episode?
I'd be delighted.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, Michael, this has been so enjoyable. I have such a romantic view of, all these sailors being on their ships, using, nature to get around. It's so much more romantic to me than these sort of diesel and the nuclear ships moving around. But this has been wonderful. Thank you so much. And the book, links are in the show notes for listeners to get, Nelson's Pathfinders. But Michael, that just leaves me to thank you very much.
Thank you. It's been a great pleasure, Oliver, to think through that extraordinary event and its setting. Thank you.
Thanks so much for listening. Plenty more history on the way, so please do subscribe. But in the meantime, thank you and good night.